One theme that's become very clear over the last few weeks and months now is that coronavirus is bringing some major changes to the way we look at the world. From a business perspective, social, but also much larger scale as well. It's going to cause permanent damage or permanent change to quite a few industries, oil and aviation already being two of the ones that are really obvious already. But it's also bringing up some really global scale issues about just how dysfunctional our current economic model is. When some people almost arbitrarily are out of work because their type of work isn't essential in a coronavirus or involves too many people being mixed together, such as theatres or cinemas or certain types of shopping malls. People in those industries are suddenly, for no fault of their own, all being laid off in very, very large numbers. So suddenly people are finding themselves with no income, but still have to pay their mortgage and still have all of their debts, all of their costs. So what we're showing us is that the economics simply doesn't work. We need to do a fundamental rethink of economics going forward as well, not just some businesses. But when I've talked about this in some of the previous videos, a lot of people have had some really useful comments, but some I've been frankly appalled at the really poor quality of the responses. People are coming back with quality of analysis that, if they tried to apply it in a business, would destroy that business. They would certainly be fired fairly quickly for the damage that they're doing to an organisation. And yet when faced with a larger scope issue, they're resorting to really shallow, very narrow focus, short term. Or else in some cases, one in particular, came back with a chunk of standard ideology. When I pointed out that this was unexamined ideology and needed to examine it because of the scope of change, he simply doubled down on the ideology. This is just not going to work long term. And the scope is actually a scope error. And the term for that kind of scope error is bikeshedding. You'll find it on Wikipedia, by the way. It's one of their warnings about how to address editing issues on Wikipedia. Because it comes from a lovely story, actually fictional, but it's illustrating real world, by Northcote Parkinson when he wrote the book Parkinson's Law. He talked about a committee which had 3 agenda items. The first was deciding on what to do about the build of a nuclear power station. The second item was about what colour and structure the bike shed should be. And the third was a discussion about expenses for refreshments during the meeting. The nuclear power station, they covered in 4.5 minutes. They just simply did a random decision because it was way outside of their ability to make decisions, so they just simply guessed. The bike shed, they spent 40 minutes arguing about exactly the bits and pieces. And the final item, the discussion about the expenses and the refreshments, they spent the entirety of the rest of the 2 hours of the meeting arguing about this, and since they hadn't come to a decision, deferred that to the next meeting. So we've got an inverse scale of attention to the actual severity or seriousness of the problem. And what's going on here is that people are answering to their level of understanding. If they all understood what a bike shed was and therefore had something to say to argue about it, almost none of them actually understood the nuclear power station or anything about it. And so they just simply skipped over it. This is what's happening with many of the issues around coronavirus, and we need to have the discipline to get past this. When we're faced with a major issue, we can't just go in for bike shedding. We've actually got to make sure that we're answering at the proper level. And that's where our disciplines come in, and also where all of the work on fractality comes in, because we're able to use the same tools at every scale. That's why these tools that work with context neutral, where we add the context to it, are so important, because we're dealing with things at every possible scale. But we need discipline around this. The other thing we need to realise is that when the context is changing on us, a lot of our previous knowledge, a lot of our existing knowledge is actually not so much no help, but an active hindrance, particularly when we're dealing with major change. And one of the things that is getting to be quite scary and which people are avoiding like crazy is that difficult as the coronavirus issues are, affecting, as I say, right the way across the scale, they're actually quite trivial by comparison with some of what's going up. I use a scale called the Mythquake scale, which is essentially in powers of 10, about the numbers of lives affected in life-changing ways. In the case of coronavirus, we're talking about tens to hundreds of millions of people's lives being affected, which is around the Mythquake 6 to 7 range in powers of 10. But some of the things that we're facing now, such as the fundamental fact that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and therefore an economics that depends on infinite growth is not viable in the longer term. That's one of the major issues. That's certainly going to a Mythquake 8, affecting billions of people, so up to billions of people. Some of the climate change issues and some of the other issues that we're facing at that sort of scale are right up to extinction level if we don't tackle them now. And we don't have much time. We need to practice on these supposedly hard issues of the coronavirus in order to get ready for the much bigger ones that are coming our way. We can't afford to hide in bike shedding. It will kill us all.